Our journey of faith is always filled with surprises, sharp turns, and occasional rejection of older truths. We may rejoice at some new opportunity or dig in our heels. The challenge is always about discernment, listening, weighing what we hear or don't in prayer and conversation within our own hearts as well as in the heart of communities like this one, where we live and move and have our being. Think about Moses, who survives because his sister Miriam finds a way to foster his life in Pharaoh's house. Both Miriam and Pharaoh's daughter acted illegally to save a life, not just for one baby boy, but for a much larger people. Shiphrah and Puah were charged by Pharaoh to snuff out all of those boy babies, but the midwives worked in secret in a shadow rebellion of civil disobedience. Our charge as people of faith is to nurture life and encourage others to do the same. That courage comes from wise and brave examples, long ago as well as today. Wisdom is key to those infants' survival. It's about justice and creativity. We could also understand those words as love, the love of God who was and is and will be creative for all time and beyond. People who encounter evil and injustice have often sought to turn the tables creatively, like the marchers in Selma and Montgomery, seeking wholeness for all people. They prayed in their churches and homes and schools, preparing for a very long siege. Those marchers put on their best Sunday going-to-meeting clothes and walked peacefully onto the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and then 5 days more on the road all the way to Montgomery. They met angry people being vicious and hateful. The TV coverage of fire hoses and billy clubs and dogs and horses attacking those peaceful marchers turned the tide. That work is well begun, but it's a very long way from being finished. The struggle for human rights and godly peace continues because we still live in a world where some people are considered less than, and some people believe they're more than. God has no truck with those claims. Paul's letter to the Galatians was written almost 2,000 years ago. He writes to the people in Galatia, which is part of Turkey, who are arguing about who's right and who's wrong in their differing practices. Some of them are Jewish converts, and some of them are pagan converts. And Paul's encouraging them to get along. Love one another. You are siblings in Christ, children of God, wherever you have come from, whatever your life may have been like. So claim Christ as your North Star rather than law. Paul's most radical line is, there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. We're meant to be one in Christ, where there is no division. One in Christ where gender and ability and age no longer separated us from God or one another. Mary of Magdala goes to the tomb to care for a corpse and finds his body gone. Two dazzling figures meet her and tell her, he's not here, but he has risen. And then, remember what he told you. The women are still afraid. Mary and her sisters in Christ, but they go and tell the 11 and the others. They're hiding. Brothers holed up behind locked doors. Mary brings them good news and hope. Yet the gospel tells us these words seemed to them to be an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Today we're turning toward a similar story, centuries later. Women in this church have wrestled with the possibility of ordination for centuries, only to be told, no, only men do that. Yet we have long called Mary of Magdala the apostle to the apostles. A scant few women may have been ordained over the centuries. St. Bridget of Kildare was abbess of a double monastery of both men and women, and eventually she oversaw all of the monasteries in Ireland in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. In the 5th century, Bishop Mael of Ardagh may have said the liturgy to ordain her as a bishop. Whether she was an abbess or a bishop, she is often shown holding a crozier, a crook, a shepherd's crook. The first woman ordained in the Anglican Communion was Florence Lee Timoy. She was a deaconess during the dark years of World War II in Hong Kong and Macau. The Bishop of Hong Kong permitted her to distribute communion in far-flung congregations and later ordained her as a priest on the 25th of January in 1944. After the Second World War ended, Bishop Hall shared his news with the Archbishop of Canterbury, named William Temple, who was deeply conflicted and made the controversy of her ordination public. Mother Timoy resigned her license to function and eventually moved to Canada. In 1971, the next two Anglican women were ordained priests, also in Hong Kong, and Lee Timoy took up her priestly vocation again. The challenge in this Episcopal church was very deep and very difficult. The canons, the rules of the church, were quite clear that women couldn't be ordained to anything. Nevertheless, the first woman missionary came to work at Pyramid Lake in 1894, and a deaconess joined her in that work in 1899. Deaconesses had been set aside beginning in 1857, and at least 17 of those deaconesses served here in Nevada, along with at least 50 lay women. The canons finally changed in 1970 when women deacons were permitted to be ordained, and deaconesses became deacons, recognized as having been ordained. Supporters of women's ordination had been pushing to change the canons for many, many years. But votes to ordain women as priests failed in both the 1970 and 1973 General Conventions. That convention was all male until Elizabeth Dyer, a lay woman, turned up with her deputation from Missouri in 1946. Great controversy. A judge from New York opined that the canons were not gender specific, and she was seated. Later in the convention, the committee decided that laymen meant what it said, and women deputies were barred until 1970. 3 retired bishops agreed to ordain 11 women deacons as priests in July of 1974. The service was hosted by the Church of the Advocate, an African-American congregation in Philadelphia. Barbara Harris was a member there then, and she led the procession as crucifer. There was enormous publicity and controversy, as well as security measures. The Bishop of Costa Rica, Jose Antonio Ramos, joined the other 3 bishops, but he didn't lay hands on the ordinands because he was an active bishop in this church. But he was there in solidarity. The difficulties didn't stop. The women were sanctioned by the church, charging them not to function as priests. The House of Bishops had a fit, eventually agreeing to a conscience clause that said any bishop might decline to ordain women in order to salve his conscience. I'm serious. At the beginning of 1979, changes to the canons meant that ordination was then open to both men and women. The conscience clause gave cover to many bishops who sneered at the possibility of ordaining women as priests. That uncanonical boys' agreement lasted for 20 years, until General Convention agreed that no one could be barred access to the ordination process on account of his or her sex. Most of the 11 women ordained in 1974, and 4 more who were ordained in Washington, D.C. in 1975, all of them had very difficult paths. One finally left the church. Many who sought calls to parish ministry were rebuffed, as well as scratched at the altar rail, spat upon, and threatened. Even after 1977, their journeys were immensely difficult. Like Mary Magdalene, they suffered, found courage, and resisted the slights and arrows of misogyny. Thanks be to God for the courageous witness of Mary and the 11, whom we just might be able to see as another band of 12 disciples. Thanks be to God for all who stand up for the downtrodden and ignored, for courageous leaders and steely-eyed partners, and for each one who will love all God's people. For God's own ongoing creativity is always more than we can imagine. Thanks be to God for creating us in riotous diversity, that together we might seek the wholeness and peace of God. Shalom, my friends. Seek peace, be peace, and keep peace in your heart.